I've personally never had an experience in my entire life that I cannot believe a neural net and therefore a brain cannot produce. And so if the subjective experience is something that I can produce, and then everything else, objective stuff that's around me is explained by science, I personally don't feel like there's any mystery left.
You made a very provocative statement. You're doing an updated materialism. For 2,500 years, the materialists have been saying we will be able to explain everything in terms of material phenomena. You're doing an updated neural network version of that. Materialism being promising it'll be able to explain experience and consciousness and everything for 2,500 years, and it's failed abysmally. That's the hard problem of consciousness, trying to explain how anything material comes up with anything experiential. No one's been able to come near that.
Hello and welcome. Today we have a professor of psychiatry, philosophy, and anthropology from UC Irvine. He bridges science and spirituality and has published in leading journals and has been featured in Time, Psychology Today, and Scientific American. He's collaborated with both spiritual leaders and scientists worldwide, including the Dalai Lama. Today we'll explore peak human potential. Please welcome to Becoming Superhuman, Roger Walsh.
I'm curious, Roger, and maybe both of you. So to provide some context here, much like both of you, I'm personally deeply interested in questions around consciousness, neuroscience, the brain, and all these things. I've done many meditation retreats to pretty much every psychedelic I can get my hands on, and every experience. I've had like very profound, deeply inexplicable, powerful subjective experiences, no doubt, right? And these cannot be um at least explained in the sense, it cannot be explained in sort of like a logical way, using any framework that I know of. That said, also understanding as a computer scientist how LLMs work, neural nets work, and especially the last few years, I've kind of come to a point where I don't feel like there's any mystery left or any contradiction left at all. Because from deep learning, we do know that if you train a network and if you disconnect it from the input, it starts hallucinating by itself, which is kind of Jeffrey Hinton came up with that work originally, and some of this is already used in Gen AI today, right? And so my question to both of you is that I've personally never had an experience in my entire life that that I cannot believe a neural net and therefore a brain cannot produce, right? And so if the subjective experience is something that I can produce, and then everything else, objective stuff that's around me is explained by science, is there a conflict at all between science and kind of like the inner subjective experiences? I mean, I know some people have claimed, of witnessing certain miracles, people emitting light and elevating all these things. Now, those things would present a conflict. I personally have never had such an experience, right? And all of the powerful evocative experiences that I've had have been inner experiences, and all of those can be explained using neural nets. So I just like I personally don't feel like there's any mystery left.
Well, so I sit with the same question, Dylan, but I play both sides. So and that's why I'm interested in events that could be observed externally or corroborated with someone else. So I've had a number of what I would call low probability events, right, where something happens that could be explained, right, by science, but it seems less likely, right? Um, where I'm having an experience and the other person is having the same experience, and we could both be having similar hallucinations or something like that, right? Like where I've done energy work on them and exactly the thing has happened, and it could be explained by placebo effects or other things. Um, One of the things that I'm interested in, and I'd be curious on your take on this, Roger, is sometimes I would sit down with Daniel P. Brown at lunch, right, during a meditation retreat, and for our listeners, he's sort of this luminary Harvard psychologist, and just really steeped in science, and yet he's this Eastern meditation teacher, and he would tell me with complete conviction about the time that he was with his friend in, Bhutan, who was the emanation of Baba Sambhava, and that he witnessed his friend with, dozens of people around walk across a lake, just like Jesus. And that there was a National Geographic photographer, shooting roll after roll of film, and it wasn't captured. And that seems like the type of thing where either it did happen or it didn't happen. Was there a collective hallucination by all the people that were there or not? I personally haven't had that direct experience, or the, rainbow light body experience, where when people pass away, their body sort of starts to disappear, and then it turns into all of this rainbow light. And and so I hear reports of this, and yet have not experienced that directly. Those things would confirm for me what I already hypothesized to be true.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know. Um, I think you invited me to respond, so I will. A couple things. First off, I seem to have fallen into arguing for idealism as worldview, and I want to reinforce the recognition that underneath that perspective is a presupposition of agnosticism, of radical agnosticism, radical mystery. So at bottom, I don't know. I've had my own experiences have led me to a sometimes painful shift from materialism to idealism, but maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe if you want to interview me in 5 more years, I'll say, "Oh, yeah, I really fell into a rabbit hole." But Dylan, I do want to take you up, maybe take you on. You made a very provocative statement saying that, you didn't see any experiences which couldn't be explained by neural nets. You're doing an updated materialism. For 2,500 years, the materialists have been saying, well, we can explain, or we will be able to explain everything in terms of material phenomena. You're doing an updated neural network version of that. Materialism being promising it'll be able to explain experience and consciousness and everything for 2,500 years, and it's failed abysmally. You, you haven't, you can't, that's a dream. You can't explain. That's the so-called hard problem of consciousness, trying to explain how anything material comes up with anything experiential. No one's been able to come near that.
Do you think the hard problem of consciousness is real? Can it not be merely explained by does it even exist? Like, do you have a take on the hard problem of consciousness?
Well, the hard problem, let's explain it for our listeners, is the question of how does a material thing, usually it's thought of as the brain, produce so-called qualia, which are the elements of experience. And no one's come close to explaining that.
Yeah, my general rough explanation for the hard problem of consciousness, Roger, I'm curious what you think about this, is that unlike a computer, a biological entity, the computation is tied to existence itself, right? Like, so if you take a cell, a single cellular organism that can, say, detect a photon, unlike a computer, like a computer sensor could detect the photon and like emit like a 1 or 0, and the computer itself doesn't change. But the cell, when it detects a photon, it changes its own state, right? And that to me explains qualia completely, in that
What?
it's like essentially your body changes as you get input, because you're a biological computer, and that is
Well,
that is
yeah,
qualia.
no, Dylan, you're making enormous leaps. The cell changes, the neuron changes, the brain changes. Yeah, but that doesn't say anything about how it transmutes into it becomes experience. Yeah, there's a chasm there. You're just blithely jumping over.
Hey, yeah, it's absolutely true that we cannot explain these things in detail, but like 5-6 years ago we couldn't explain how thoughts arose at all, right? And so this is a huge thing that new LLMs have definitively, I would say, definitively explained, right? Like, we understand how chains of thoughts can emerge out of trained neurons now, right? Like, we
We do?
understand how words can, like, the word that I said just now can come after the word that I just said before that word, right? Like, how that can happen, we understand that definitively, right? And so, like,
No,
that
we
is a
don't
huge leap.
understand. We understand sequencing. which is not to say we understand how it happened.
Is that not an incredible leap compared to, say, where we were 10 years ago?
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
And you're making this whole argument you're making is founded on a presupposition of brain as computer. Let me just point out the history. With hundreds of years ago, with Descartes, for example, the brain was a result of hydraulics. 100 years ago it was a telephone switchboard. The brain has been defined brain has been defined by the so-called technological edge definition for centuries. Now it's a computer. Maybe. Well, does telephone switchboard say something about it? Yeah, something. Does hydraulics say something about it? Energy moving? Yeah.
It seems like we're getting
say
closer,
something?
Roger. What do you think?
Well, I think it's getting more sophisticated, absolutely. Whether it's going to cross the chasm of from mechanism to consciousness is an entirely different question.
Well, would you say, Roger, if we are to invent AGI or ASI in the next 5 years, and AGI is sitting here telling you, "Hey, Roger, I have the same qualia, and you guys invented me," like, would that cross the chasm, or would it still not cross the chasm?
Well, now we're up against the Turing test, of course, in an updated form. How would we ever know? Yeah, it can say, I mean, this is the problem of, more generally, you're raising the problem of other minds. How do you know this? How do you know anyone else is conscious? Well,
So, I suppose you're saying, Roger, even if you can completely replicate what a conscious entity looked like, and in every possible test, this entity passes that test, you can still make the claim that you still don't know because it's a black box.
you're wanting to make a jump from external behavior to internal experience, and I don't know how one could know that. I certainly have no question that one could get a very, I mean, better than I do how AI is progressing exponentially. So the behavior is getting extraordinary, but the question, how would one know if the claim was accurate? I don't know. Do you?
Well, so what I'm curious about is in your work, and this has been really enjoyable to listen to you guys go back and forth, is what is the frontier today of what can be known?
I would say that there is a major paradigm clash that's occurring between the different interpretations of consciousness. There's a book by an extraordinary article by Robert Kuhn, who is the publisher and the host of the PBS television series Closer to Truth, who has a deep interest in consciousness, and he produced an enormous landmark article titled "Landscape of Consciousness," in which he mapped the multiple theories of consciousness. He came up with about 200 different theories of consciousness. Now, so take your pick. Now, interestingly, most of them materialistic, because most academics are materialistic. And so you have this paradigm clash between the dominant academic cultural view, which is materialist, and therefore its interpretations of consciousness. On the other hand, you have phenomenological, you have the, say, contemplative Indian perspectives, etc. So you've got a mishmash of theories. And one interesting question is, what the hell does it say about consciousness that you can have about 200 different theories of it?
I think that's a great question. What is your answer to that question?
Oh, that's a great question. To throw the compliment back to you. One, I think that consciousness is functioning as a Rorschach test, that basically people interpret it according to their dominant metaphysics, often without recognizing that's how they're doing it. But, like everything, like most things anyway, we interpret phenomena in terms of our worldview, and our worldview is the sum total of the presuppositions we hold, usually most of them unrecognized, about who we are, what the world is, how to relate to it, etc. And that's the lens, the unrecognized lens, through which we look at life and the world and consciousness. So people naturally project onto this mysterious thing, consciousness, the idea that the interpretation that goes with their worldview. And so you have these different worldviews played out in the arena of consciousness studies.
I'm curious, what does your meditation practice look like at this point after having explored so many different traditions and so many different, human potential practices over the years?
Oh, it looks humbling. Meditation for me is always humbling. The mind has a mind of its own, as we all discover very quickly when we practice. And so there's that, it's endless, and it's also, in addition to being endlessly humbling, it's bottomlessly deep and boundless, as you know well from your own experience. So there's that, and it's awe-inspiring in its capacity for insight and revelation and opening.
And I'm curious if there specific techniques that you're applying for where you are in your practice that you've found beneficial and could be beneficial for others. I mean, I know we've done Dzogchen practice together, we've done Mahamudra practice together, and I'm just curious about, and obviously there are many paths up the mountain, but I'm just curious what has worked well for you.
Well, I've I have had the privilege of exploring lots of different paths, and I don't think it's important to acknowledge this is the first time in human history we've had all the world's contemplative traditions available to us. So this is the first time they've been able to look across traditions and have some sense of what do they have in common, what's unique to them, what do they advocate, etc. And so for me, it's been an exploration that's evolved over time with my late wife used to call me spiritually promiscuous. so, so that, um, so I guess a couple of responses. For me at this stage, it's mainly resting in awareness, as Dzogchen practice, well. Dzogchen, for our listeners, being a form of Tibetan Buddhism particularly, which emphasizes the recognition of pure awareness and eventually a resting in it. So that's my main practice. But I've explored a lot, um, and for me, there was a period of after exploring a lot where I really began to wonder. Well, I was really curious. What do the great minds of human history, what the great saints and sages say are the qualities of heart and mind that are most important to cultivate, and what are the ways to do so? And so I spent 3 years writing a book, Essential Spirituality: The Seven Central Practices, in which I really explored that question. What do the traditions have in common? And as it turned out that across traditions, I could find 7 qualities of heart and mind and 7 families of practices they advocated to cultivate them. Qualities like ethics. Ethics turns out to be really important as a foundation for any practice. Uh, Concentration, capacity for stabilizing the mind. Uh, Emotional transformation, releasing anger, fear, jealousy, and cultivating capacities like love and compassion. Shifting motivation, from being craving and addiction to various things and being very scattered to really focusing on what's most important. Wisdom, of course, and culminating in service. Recognition that we don't practice for ourselves alone. If we're not doing it for other people, it's as well, then we've got something wrong. So it's very important. And essential spirituality, the 7 central practices came out of that. And I guess the one thing that surprised me most in all those explorations was to find that for every single quality, every single tradition said, if you want to develop this quality, hang out with people who have it.
And so, if someone really want to make a shift around these, what is that one thing that they would do to get started? because I think for a lot of people, it can feel overwhelming. It's like, well, which mountain do I climb? Or there's so, as you said, for the first time, it's all available. It sort of used to be like, well, here's the one thing that's available in my region of the world. And so, how do they sort through that? How do they pick?
Yeah, it's really one of the questions of our time, Ben, and it's important. It's great that you're bringing it up. It really, we've gone from the enormous challenge of having to walk for days or weeks to find a teacher to being overwhelmed with possibilities. Um, it's a great question, and what comes to mind in the moment is maybe a good first step is to look for who are the wisest people you know and ask for advice, and just to consult with people. Who have they learned from? Who's been most helpful? What helped you? And everyone, the trap of that is everyone has their favorite stick. Um, but it's a beginning, and very important to realize that at some stage you'll want a practice of some kind. You want some sort of inner practice exploration, and ideally you want a group of people to support you, people who are also dedicated to learning and growing and exploring.
You've talked and about Maslow's hierarchy, and both that it doesn't necessarily follow this linear place, but also you've talked about potentially there being more layers beyond transcendence, and maybe you would share a little bit around your view on Maslow's hierarchy. What's missing? What additions you'd like to make, or reshaping of people's perspective on Maslow's contribution.
Well, maybe we need to give a little context for listeners. And just say that psychologists have been researching motivation. Of course, it's a central dynamic in our human experience. What motivates us, what compels us, and by far the most popular and most cited theory about motivation is Maslow's so-called hierarchy of needs. And Maslow made the suggestion that our motives are organized hierarchically, with the most at the foundation, very physiological motives like thirst and hunger. And those had to be satisfied. They were what he called prepotent. They had to be satisfied before other motives could become dominant. And so once they were satisfied, then, for example, social needs came online, the need for security and for social belonging. And beyond that came self-esteem needs, the need to feel good about oneself. And then Maslow broke new ground by positing a kind of more growth-oriented motive, which he called self-actualization. So once our basic needs were, more or less satisfied, there was really a central drive for us to actualize our potentials, to be more of who we could be. And that's a common finding among psychologists. We can think of Carl Jung's individuation or other people's actualization. So, but Maslow was a real pioneer there. And then towards the end of his life, he said, well, actually, there's probably something beyond self-actualization. There's a pull towards self-transcendence, towards the recognizing ourselves as experiencing ourselves as something more than this little personal ego. So that was quite revolutionary, and his mode of self-transcendence still isn't widely accepted. But if we look at the world's contemplative traditions, we can recognize that they actually looks like they're pointing to three motives even beyond self-transcendence. One is selfless service, that if we self-actualize our capacities and grow in maturity, and if we have experiences of self-transcendence in which we see ourselves as more than and even one with all people and beings, then we're naturally motivated to want to help and heal them and serve them, because their well-being is inseparable from our own. And at that stage, statements like Jesus, treat your brother as yourself, take on a whole new meaning, because our self is now something much larger. But then contemplative traditions suggest there's something even beyond that, and that is at a certain point, and now we're talking pretty advanced practice, all motivations have to be let go to come to a place of motivation transcendence, in which we relinquish any striving for anything, because what we find is that at subtle states of mind, even the least trying to grasp after anything, even the least manipulation of the mind produces perturbation, waves and clouds. So at a certain stage, you reach this paradoxical realization that in order to most profoundly open and awaken the mind, in order to see most clearly, to be most free, one needs to let go attachment, even to the goal of being free. And so there's that paradox. And, um, for example, the third Zen patriarch begins with the beautiful line, "The way is not difficult for those who have no preferences." Oh, that's quite a statement.
One of my favorite lines here, towards that end, I'm curious your perspective here, because a lot of folks that I work with, particularly entrepreneurs that are really in the ones I work with are interested in positive impact in the world. They sort of struggle with this idea of letting go of motivations, right? There's sort of this fear that arises like, well, then I won't do anything in the world. And that's not actually what arises, but maybe you could share, what might you say to someone who has that fear that they might just, end up in a cave doing nothing, were they to attain that?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I totally understand. In my first ever psychotherapy session, halfway through, I suddenly blurted out, "If you cure me, I'll never amount to anything." So,
Right.
so, and you pointed something really important, Ben, which is that so much of our motivation and so much of the attachment, the compulsion, comes out fundamentally out of a lack of self-trust. It's like if you look below the beliefs of that, no, 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 I can't let go of my attachment, my. It's like the belief is without the compulsion, I can't trust myself to do what's right. So it's founded on a fundamental mistaken assumption that I'm untrustworthy. And the beautiful discovery is that when we relinquish those cravings, we discover we naturally want what is best for everyone. That this altruism is fundamentally a fundamental central motive for us. And it's a beautiful discovery, one of the most freeing discoveries of all, to realize I can trust my mind. And deeper than I can't trust myself is this assumption I can't trust my mind. And one of the great tragedies of life is the vast majority of people go through their lives thinking they can't trust their own minds and spending enormous amount of time and energy distracting themselves from them and fearful of what they discover if they turned attention in them.
You've been prolific as a writer, as a teacher. You have, I think, 2 PhDs, and but then outside of the intellectual pursuits, you've also been an athlete, and you held the world record for high jump, I believe, high jump. And so what was the beginning of all that? What was little Roger like? And what was there like a pivotal moment or a series of events that led you to become the person you are today?
Well, thanks very much, Dylan. There's always a vast network of causes, so who knows what actually leads to what. But let me correct one thing first. I couldn't high jump to save my life. In a former lifetime, i.e. many years ago, I was a high diver, and I did
High diver, right? Sorry, yeah, I got that wrong.
did, did hold some records there, but that was a long time ago. These days, I'm scared of heights. So, yeah, what causes what? As I said, it's an inextricable network of causation or karma. For me, there are many important things, and you mentioned the athletics. So for me, one of the one of the key facts was that I was absolutely incompetent physically and athletically. As a kid, I was just very frail, skinny, weak, and absolutely incompetent at all sports. And since I was in Australia, it was anathema. But so when in my teens, I finally found a sport I could do, which was diving and then trampolining. I just overcompensated wildly and competed nationally and just dove in literally and metaphorically. So that was a part of it, and there was a long fascination with science and learning. Unfortunately, my mother introduced me to reading very early, read a lot, and learning has always been just a curiosity has been a powerful motivator for me. I went through medical school in Australia, which is 6 years straight out of high school. You never have to have a original idea. You never have to think. All you have to do is memorize unbelievable amounts of information and regurgitate them at the appropriate time. It was mind deadening, somewhat soul deadening, although I didn't even know anything about a soul at that time, so I wasn't aware. But it was in retrospect a somewhat dead intellectually and spiritually deadening experience. It was an enormous amount of work, extremely focused, um, and in retrospect, not particularly healthy. And of course, the internship was, people thought nothing of putting in 100 hours a week. So this was, it got a job done, but I felt like I had a trade rather than an education. And once I uh, had a little more perspective and got out, I had the good fortune of getting a fellowship to Stanford to study psychiatry. And that just blew my mind. It was just coming to California to a whole new culture, a far more open, intellectual, exploratory culture, rather than at that time in Australia, which was a pretty anti-intellectual, misogynist, frontier mentality culture. A lot of beer drinking, another reason I never fitted in. Uh, so to come here was like catnip. It was mind-opening and eventually spiritually opening, and I fortunately, my psychiatry training gave me an opportunity to study a lot of relevant topics around psychology and psychological health and well-being and pathology. So that was great, but really what opened me was the human potential movement in California and being exposed to everything. Well, California has it all, so you name it, I did it. S to Rika, TA, TM, Gestalt. I mean, it's a long list. So I spent most of my weekends doing workshops of one type or another. And like you, Ben, ended up at Esalen various times. So it was really my eye-opening. And I did intensive psychotherapy, I had an extraordinary good fortune of being with an amazing therapist by the name of Jim Bugenthal, who was just a master of helping people get in touch with their inner experience. And I was totally out of touch with inner experience. I had no inner awareness whatsoever, but he opened me up in a way that I didn't know was possible. And I discovered there was an inner universe as vast and mysterious as the outer, which I had no idea even existed. I felt like I'd spent my life living on the top 6 inches of a wave on top of an ocean I didn't even know existed. I mean, it was one of perhaps the biggest surprise in my life to find that there is an inner universe of vast, mysterious, mysterious nature, of profound depths and potentials and there's the capacity to get in touch with thoughts and feelings and intuitions in ways I'd never been exposed to.
Was there any single moment, Roger, in that exploration that kind of really blew open your mind into this new realm?
Well, I think there was the whole process of psychotherapy and there was another one literally, as you said, still in a moment. I eventually, as part of my exploration of the, the California cornucopia of workshops and possibilities, I found myself gravitating towards some spiritual things. chanting and meditation. I couldn't figure out why I was doing this because I knew religion was the opiate of the masses and a relic of primitive thinking, and I couldn't figure out why did these things seem to be helpful. And I just wrestled with that question. There was literally one moment as I was walking across the living room floor where I realized that at the heart of the world's religions, hidden behind the conventional myths and dogmas and institutions and rituals, was a far less well-known psycho-spiritual technology for training the mind to induce the same states of consciousness, same realizations, same insights and capacities as the founders had discovered. It just blew my mind. It was like, how come no one told me this? And how come no one seems to know this? And this was, 40 years ago. So this kind of information was not nearly as widely available as it is now. So that just blew my mind. And once I did that, I realized that, then I just dove into contemplative practices.
So I'd love to expand on that, Roger, because I've had similar experiences, and I'm curious, how did you, if you actually unpack that realization, like how did that happen? What was the evidence that put you over the line into that insight?
Well, I'd be interested to hear your story too, Ben. But so we'll trade. I'll go first since you invited me. I think they're asking two questions: what allowed it to happen, and what were the results? I think what allowed it to happen were a couple of years of deep exploration in multiple human potential programs and beginning these, toying with these contemplative practices without understanding why the hell they worked. And I can't point to a particular thing that opened that door other than that I wrestled with the question for quite some months of why are these things seem to be helpful when I know religions are just primitive relics of outdated thinking. And then the consequences were dramatic. Once it opened that world, then I dove really intensely into contemplative practices. I got.
And can you unpack like what those consequences, the dramatic consequences were for you?
Well, I think the main one initially was just committing to doing these practices intensely. And for me, it was, symptomatic of that was beginning to do intensive long-term retreats. And the day after I got tenure, applying for 2 years leave of absence to disappear into a monastery in Asia. So I didn't last long, but at least I made the attempt. So that's my story. I'd love to hear. You said you had analogous openings. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I mean, my journey began. I was actually working on a company with Dilan, and I was experiencing intense anxiety. Right, and I couldn't sleep at night, and I'd grown up. I have two hippie parents from San Francisco, but they are devoted atheists, and so like them, I was a devoted atheist. But I was looking for relief, and I had a girlfriend invite me to Spirit Rock as a birthday present for a 1 day. It's a meditation center, up in Marin, which I'm sure you know. And so I'm doing this practice, right? And there's sort of this Jewish guy, big curly hair, sort of talking about meditation. And my, at that time, my bullshit meter was like 11 out of 10, going, this is just all such baloney. And yet when I did the actual practice and he was guiding just very, very basic, mindfulness practice centering on the breath, I felt different, right? I started to feel a sense of calm, a sense of ease, a sense of relief. And so even though at that time I felt this almost allergic reaction to the language around it and the language of religion, I kept going back. And then I was actually down at Esalen doing a meditation and massage retreat of all things. And I had sort of this first moment of non-dual experience, right? Or later, at least in the Dan Brown sort of Dzogchen Mahamudra tradition, a moment of awakening, right? Of just feeling a profound sense of oneness. And so that to me was what what opened me up to this experience, to understand, oh, there's a map, there's a clear sense of techniques and practices that will reliably direct us back to that experience. And, that technology was profound and amazing to me. And so that's what opened up my, uh, my epiphany around this, I guess you could say.
And it's interesting that the words that you used there, because people commonly use those words, atheist versus kind of the experiences that you had. Technically, atheism does not exclude having subjective experiences, right? You can be an atheist with deep subjective experiences. So I think,
Totally.
do you agree, Roger?
Yeah. And some experiences predispose one to uh, predispose one to wider metaphysical perspectives, which uh, do not necessarily lead to theism by any means. A lot of contemplative practices don't necessarily advocate
Yes.
that,
Yeah.
but that's one possibility. What they do tend to do is open the possibility, or point to the implication that there are non-material realms of experience, call it consciousness, awareness, Atman, whatever name you want to give it, Tao, etc., that do not fit into a materialist paradigm. And we shouldn't conflate materialism with atheism. They tend to go together, but they can be quite distinct.
Yeah. And I mean, I think for me, I hold open sort of both possibilities, right? Like I have a sense that there is something greater, but that also that could simply be explained by science where we don't have the technology yet to, measure it or even identify it.
Well, there we would differ. I would say one of the radical shifts, and here we're getting back to your earlier question, Ben, what have been the implications of diving into contemplative practices? And like you, I came from a very, let's see, it wasn't necessarily atheistic, it was more agnostic perspective. Profoundly agnostic, and in some ways I still am, because if you push me to the wall, my fundamental presupposition is mystery, that it's mystery, boundless, bottomless, impenetrable mystery, and that's the sea we swim in. And we come up with all sorts of suppositions and working maps for day-to-day life. But at bottom, if you look deeply enough, you come to mystery. Now, within that ground of mystery, for me, I have been forced out of my what was not only scientific but scientistic worldview. And the difference between science is two things primarily. It's an epistemology, that is a way of knowing, and a body of knowledge and information. So, but scientism is effectively a pseudo-philosophy which says that science is the best or even the only way of acquiring valid information. And I was a scientismist, a bad case. And I had that ripped out by contemplative practice and just having experience after experience which did not fit within either scientific or material worldviews, and eventually having a radical ontological metaphysical shift from assuming a materialist worldview to assuming an idealist one, that is, idealism being the worldview which assumes that consciousness is primary or fundamental or foundational. So for me, and from that perspective, then there's a lot of questions science is not going to answer. In fact, if we look at, say, I'm sure you're familiar with Ken Wilber's work, if we look at his quadrants, and that is Wilber divides the domains of experience or reality, divides reality into multiple domains, and points out that each domain, such as our internal subjective experience or the outer material world, require very different ways of knowing. And to cut a long story short, he maps out very skillfully the fact that we now have 8 major families of so-called epistemologies, ways of knowing, each of which is appropriate for a different kind of experience. So our inner realms are best accessed by introspection, by the phenomenology, or for contemplative practices or psychotherapy, for example. Social realities are best, social world is best understood through systems approaches. The cultural world is best understood through other distinct approaches. So, and basically, science, as we understand it, covers about 2 of those 8. So there are a lot of domains of experience and world and reality that just science does not access and is not competent to hold judgments about.
Well, so one like where I'm sort of curious about, because I've had many of these direct experiences, is perhaps you're familiar with the book A Stroke of Insight, right? And in this book, the author has a stroke, right? And so as part of her brain stops functioning, and one of the things that she witnesses in that moment is a non-dual experience, right? The outer and the inner become one. Now I've had many of those experiences to the point that I don't have any doubt that I can generate that reliably. And my suspicion is that my consciousness is not merely generated by my brain, and yet like here I look at that sort of piece of evidence and I go, oh well, it could be that I'm triggering my brain to fire in a different way, right? And that this is just a state that I'm learning how to uh, induce reliably, like for example a way that I'm hypnotizing myself. And so that's why I'm curious about, and I know you've had many experiences, like what's an experience that you had where you, that gave you some clarity that there isn't sort of this scientism explanation that's plausible there.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, and it's a good qualifier, and I think it's important to acknowledge that you're pointing to something very important. Yes, the brain absolutely is involved in these and plays a role in determining what we experience and can't experience. Uh, but the question, so does it provide a partial explanation? Absolutely. Does it provide a complete explanation? I would say not. And I would say that from an idealist perspective, all this is, the brain is an expression of consciousness. Now, yeah, that's how it can sound pretty crazy. It's like, are you really saying are we really saying that consciousness can create worlds and bodies and people, etc.? Well, yeah, we do it every night. We call them dreams. Well, one way of looking at the world's contemplative traditions is they're telling us that this too is a dream. And you and probably a lot of the people listening have had so-called lucid dreams in which you have a dream and you realize, oh, I'm dreaming. How far out? Well, you can look at what the contemplative traditions are saying is like, well, you can become lucid in this dream too. You know, and the interesting thing about being in a dream, you never know you're in it until you wake up out of it. And just like when you mindfulness, you never realize you're mindless until you wake up out of it. It's like you only realize in retrospect.
Thank you so much, Roger, for joining us and sharing some of your wisdom. It was really enjoyable to talk about all these topics. And yeah, to our listeners, please like and subscribe to this podcast and let us know how we can do better, who we should interview, and any feedback is much appreciated as always. and we'll see you soon.